I'd like to welcome everybody to this installation in the Storer Lectureship in the Life Sciences. It's my pleasure to introduce Peter Crane as our speaker today. Peter got his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Reading in England, and it's during that time when I first met him at a castle in what was then Czechoslovakia. For a meeting 30 years ago, where he gave a talk on fossil leaf flowers from southern England. A couple of years later, I encountered him again at the first International Paleobotany Congress, which he was a co-organizer of, still as a graduate student, and he presented a talk on a fossil member of the birch family, in which he showed that by associating leaves and reproductive structures, you could say much, much more on the position of this extinct group in the birch family in the evolutionary tree of that group. And I was impressed, I think, that this is somebody that we're going to hear more about, who's going to go somewhere, and indeed he has. From England, he went to a postdoc at the University of Indiana with David Dilcher, working on reproductive structures of early flowering, fossil flowering plants, and then to the Field Museum in Chicago in '82. And while there, he was one of the main movers behind what you might think of as the second revolution in angiosperm paleobotany with Elsa Marie Fries, which resulted from their recognition that you could get whole fossil flowers out of sediments and thereby increase by an order of magnitude your confidence in how these fossils related to living groups. But he was doing other things too. He was one of the first people to do a serious phylogenetic analysis of the relationships among seed plants and the origin of angiosperms. He was involved in quantitative analyses of the diversity of early flowering plants through time and space during the time they were rising to dominance. At the same time, he rose in the administration of the Field Museum to be director of scientific programs and accumulated a large number of honors, such as Fellowship of the Royal Society, member of the National Academy of Sciences of the U.S., the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences, the German Academy, and others. And after this, he moved in '99 to be director of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, probably the premier botanical research and conservation institution in the world. And for his contributions to horticulture and conservation while there, he was knighted in 2004. But after putting in these 7 years of service to Queen and country, we're glad that he's back now in the U.S. as Sullivan Professor in the Department of Geophysical Sciences and the Committee of Evolutionary Biology at the University of Chicago, and thus more accessible to us. His talk today is going to draw on both his scientific research career and his experiences as the director of Kew. He's going to be talking about wild nature, gardens, and the future of plants. Peter.
Jim, thanks very much indeed, and thank you for all coming this afternoon. I got the sense from when I was asked to give these two lectures, which I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to do, that they were, in a sense, in some way, career summarizing kind of presentations. And as you've heard, in a sense, I've had sort of two careers, one as a researcher and one as an administrator of collections-based, biological diversity-based institutions. And so today, or rather during this visit, rather than trying to give two different topics on my paleobotanical research, I decided that I would leave all of that until tomorrow. So tomorrow you'll hear a very different talk, one focused on paleobotany. And what you'll get today is really a perspective that I've come to from my time as an administrator at the Field Museum and as director of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And that perspective really comes from taking organizations that have large samples of biological diversity in the context of collections and figuring out how to make them more relevant and more interesting. And what you'll hear particularly about today is my experiences at Kew, and they're colored by the wonderful, rich series of things that I got engaged in at Kew, and also my opportunity through Kew, which is really a government-sponsored research organization, to have a chance to be in touch with senior civil servants and also senior politicians of their view of some of the issues that we routinely consider. So in today's presentation on wild nature, gardens, and the future of plants, you'll hear mainly about my work at Kew, some of the things that Kew was engaged in, and particularly some of the questions of plant conservation biology that Kew was working on. And I hope I can put this in the context of some scientific results that you probably wouldn't have seen before that deal with plant diversity and what we do and what we don't understand about the variety of plant life on our planet. But I want to start with the Field Museum. I first took on a administrative role at the Field Museum back in the early to mid 1990s, and this was a collections-based organization, and really the question was, how could we give it a stronger environmental and particularly a stronger conservation focus? And we founded two programs, one called the Environmental and Conservation Biology, another called Center for Cultural Understanding and Change, and those two things have now fused together into what I think is a kind of an exemplary program in conservation biology, and how the resources at places like the Field Museum can be leveraged to the general cause of conservation. And the approach that group, headed by Debbie Moskowitz, has taken has really been to focus on identifying areas that should be priority for in situ conservation by leveraging the systematic expertise that scientists have, deploying it towards rapid inventories, and therefore helping to decide among competing priorities for in situ conservation. The second area, which is where the cultural side comes in, is really engaging with local peoples so that they can be directly engaged in the stewardship of those areas. And then the third area is building capacity in a variety of ways, not only in training, but also in developing appropriate tools. And I think that program has been pretty successful. On the rapid inventory side, they've used the biological and anthropological expertise to evaluate areas of potential conservation importance, and also to understand the kind of social background in which those areas can be managed for the future. On the biological side, that means using the expertise of specialists in plant and animal diversity, both in terrestrial and in aquatic systems, to identify priority areas, and to work with anthropologists on inventorying the social connections that are important to maintaining those areas in the future. Most of that effort has been focused in South America, and I think, and I can't really claim any credit for it because much of this work has been done after I left, that they now have something on the order of 35,000 square miles of new protected areas scattered through Ecuador, Peru, and adjacent areas. And I think that's a tremendous example of how the expertise in natural history organizations can be leveraged into real conservation impact. At the same time, because obviously in an organization like the Field Museum, the same applies to Kew, you always have to be asking what's the local relevance of what you do. And so that effort overseas was balanced by efforts in the Chicago region and the formation of an initiative that we call the Chicago Wilderness Initiative, focused on protecting the biological diversity embedded in the Chicago metropolitan area. And in both of those circumstances, the real question is building the engagement among local residents to become long-term stewards of those environments. In terms of building capacity, training is the thing that we always think of, or perhaps we think about institution building and physical facilities, herbaria and the like. But I think another key area is building conservation-based tools. The fact of the matter is that when systematists study the things that they do, they're sometimes not thinking of the end users in terms of people who need to be able to rapidly identify the plants and animals so that they can come to a conservation assessment of an area. And using, for example, a herbaria, using color photographs of plants taken in the field, you can put together very rapidly useful collections-based tools that are really helpful in the field, and perhaps in a way more helpful than the traditional outputs of floras and monographs that say plant systematists would produce. And those tools extend not only to plants, but at the field they also extended very much to birds, and particularly, for example, on bird calls and how they could, training people to identify birds largely from their calls, which is the way that this is mainly done in these kinds of ecosystems. On the plant side, Robin Foster has really led the charge on developing a whole series of color guides which incorporate photographs taken in the field with herbarium specimens to provide rapid tools for plant identification, which is absolutely fundamental to the evaluation of tropical areas for their conservation potential. And the results, I think, have been very, very good. And I look back on that time at the Field Museum as a way in which we were able to take the resources that we had available to us and turn them into something that's really useful from the standpoint of conservation. So here I am now at Kew, and I'm wondering how can I use some of those lessons that I've learned at the Field Museum with regard to Kew. And the question of relevance in a large organization like Kew is just as important as it was at the field. Kew is largely a government-funded research institution. Its overall annual operating budget is somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million a year, including the capital operating grant and aid, but also the monies that we receive from various commercial ventures. And obviously one has to worry all the time about what government is actually getting for that investment, that very substantial investment. And you have to look at the basic assets of Kew too, and one is that it's an old royal estate with a long history. This is George III's father, photographed at Kew, and it was George III's mother who really started the gardens at Kew in 1759. And the house that you see in the background there, which is called Kew Palace, still exists on the grounds of Kew, and was instrumental, was one of the many things that were instrumental in getting Kew designated as a World Heritage Site during my time there. And one of the more interesting and slightly trying experiences was when the Queen decided, or Prince Charles decided, to have her 80th birthday party in our back garden about this time last year. And that took place in Kew Palace, which has great historical relevance for the British monarchy. Queen Victoria's parents, for example, were married in Kew Palace. Also, it's a place not only with great significance in terms of its association with the monarchy, but also in terms of its association with the history of landscape design. This is a map of what's basically now Kew Gardens, made in the 1770s. And what it shows very clearly is the very two different contrasting approaches of two different landscape designers. The one above, a naturalistic landscape designed by Capability Brown. The one below, a very different landscape set out by a man called Sir William Chambers. Chambers also did some other remarkable things. He built a pagoda, for example, in the early 1760s. At Kew, he built other marvelous buildings like the Orangery. Those are buildings that still exist. A lot of the others have now long since gone. We had an Alhambra, we had a mosque, for example, not to mention two different menageries associated with the two different estates. And the plant collections are pretty fantastic too. This is one of the oldest specimens of ginkgo planted in Europe. Ginkgo only came back to Europe from Japan right about 1700. This specimen tree of ginkgo at Kew was planted in the early 1760s and still flourishes there on the site today. And of course, Kew has had a long association with other marvelous plants in horticulture, bird of paradise flowers, the Titan arum, and so on. So taking these resources, and this is just part of what Kew has to be sort of factored into account when you're thinking about how to develop the organization. Kew receives about 1.5 million visitors a year, so it was one of the larger visitor attractions in the UK. During the last 3 years there, we had about 40 hours of television on BBC, and that raised our profile very significantly. So on the one hand, there's a large public, cultural, historical dimension, but on the other hand, there's the botanical research side. And I really felt that we need to view botanic gardens in the same way that zoos had been viewed. And my old friend, who's known to some of us, George Rabb, at the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago, really sort of set out this trajectory along which zoos have traveled over the last couple of hundred years. And one might say that zoos, to some extent, have been driven along that trajectory by, in a way, the anachronism of keeping living animals. I felt very strongly that botanical gardens also needed to move along that trajectory. They maybe didn't have the same forces pushing them so actively along that trajectory, but I think the issue is fundamentally the same. We're basically concerned with the variety of life. In the case of botanic gardens, the variety of plant life. And so I was never very happy with the view of places like the Field Museum or of places like Kew that saw themselves as somehow systematics institutions. I was much more interested in seeing them as biological diversity, or in the case of Kew, plant diversity institutions, interested in how that diversity came to be, how it's doing today, how it can be conserved and used in sustainable ways for human benefit. So that was the kind of trajectory that I wanted to take Kew along, and I think we did it to some degree, and I'll talk about some of the projects that we were engaged in more specifically. But before I get into that, I want to say a few general words about plant diversity. Some of you may have seen in Nature, I think 2 weeks ago, that this is the tercentenary of the birth of Linnaeus this year. Linnaeus catalogued in 1753 all of the plants that he knew of in the world, and he wrote that he thinks there's probably no more than 10,000 species of plants in the world in 1753. And by the way, interestingly, one of the things that Linnaeus thought was that the tropics weren't terribly diverse, and that was because his early collectors who went to the tropics were largely bringing back common weeds from the tropics, and so he was getting a kind of already a very human, altered view of tropical ecosystem. The decandoles in the mid-19th century got up to about 58,000, so the number of plant species grew pretty dramatically through that time. We now know that the number is closer to 400,000, and that's a very large number, and I think that has consequences for the way that we deal with plant diversity. And I always like to show flowering plants in relation to vertebrates, just to kind of emphasize that it's a very rich group, and it's right and proper that we set our conservation priorities on the basis of the groups that we know very well, but we should always be worrying about whether those groups are giving us the same story as some of the more diverse groups. And I'm sure an entomologist would show exactly the same slide with angiosperms in a different position. Organizations like Kew, I think, are the natural places for studying that huge variety of plant life, because they contain amazing preserved collections, which are the essential samples that we need to study this. In the case of Kew, the herbarium numbered about 8 million specimens, and there were other kinds of collections associated with that, economic botany collections, for example. But also, unlike museums, botanic gardens have living collections, and that creates opportunities for research, but it also creates opportunities for conservation that I'll talk about particularly later. And some of the plants are nothing short of remarkable. This Encephalatus altensteinii is the same specimen that was brought back by Francis Masson from the Cape around about 1780. We call it the oldest pot, or we used to call it the oldest pot plant in the world. It's still living there, but it's no longer mine in a sense. But it's a fantastic plant, and to have specimens like that around, they're valuable not only from a scientific point of view and from a historical point of view, but also from a conservation point of view, because that species, like many other species of cycads, is very endangered in the wild. And then alongside those collections go the other things. In the case of Kew, not only a wonderful library, but remarkable art collections. A gallery, for example, of more than 800 paintings made by a wonderful Victorian lady called Marianne North. So how do you take all this and do something useful with it from a conservation point of view? How many plant species are there? Well, here are some of the numbers that have been bandied around, and there's quite a bit of variance among them. And really the ironic thing is that we actually know much more accurately how many names of plant species there are than how many plant species there are. And that's a result, in the case of Kew, of a remarkable gift, actually, that Darwin left in his will to my predecessor, William Jackson Hooker. Joseph Dalton Hooker. And Joseph Dalton Hooker was arguably Darwin's closest friend, very much involved in persuading Darwin to publish and arranging the joint reading of the Darwin-Wallace paper at the Linnaean Society. And Darwin left money to develop what he called a nomenclature, because he was already confused in the mid-19th century by the number of names that were floating around, which weren't actually synonymized down to species. We've been keeping that up. And then maybe a decade or so ago, we joined with Harvard and the Australian National Herbarium to computerize that list, which is now available and searchable online through the International Plant Names Index. And there's somewhere close to 1 million names in that list. And the real argument about how many species there are boils down to what is the degree of synonymy among those names. And the numbers, the latest numbers from Kew, would suggest that the number is nearer to 400,000 than it is to 250,000. And there's been a good deal of effort to develop these checklists. You can see some of them on the Kew website, where, for example, there's pretty much a complete checklist of all monocots, about a fifth of flowering plant diversity now. You can see some, too, on the Missouri Botanical Gardens Tropicos website. And those of you that regularly use the Mellon-funded database, the name of which has gone out of my mind at the moment, for JSTOR, the journal database. If you take a look at JSTOR now, on the opening page of JSTOR, you'll be able to access a thing called the API, the African Plants Initiative, part of the Aluka initiative, also funded by the Mellon Foundation. And there you can see not only a complete species list of all the plants in Africa, about 50 to 60,000 species, but you can also call up images of those species from herbarium specimens in 50 different organizations around the world. So gradually, Kew and institutions like it are gradually getting their act together to take this very long list, synonymize it, get the information available on the web. There's still a lot more to do, but it's moving in a useful, I think, direction. So that's in terms of documenting how many species are there. The next question is where do they grow? And this is very important. Plant distributions are fed very much into, for example, the identification by Norman Myers and Conservation International of these so-called biodiversity hotspots. Includes data from a variety of sources, but certainly plant data has been very influential. Obviously, if you don't have a complete species list of all of the plants, it's very difficult to expect that there might be a complete enumeration of those plants' distributions. This is probably the best map that we have in terms of the global distribution of species number of vascular plants. This is put together by Wilhelm Barthelot and his colleagues at the University of Bonn. It highlights those areas that are very rich in plant diversity and picks up many of the places that you'd expect, the Andes, the Mata Atlantica, and so on, but also perhaps points out the high diversity of some of the Mediterranean ecosystems, particularly of southern Africa and southwestern Australia. But when one actually looks at the data on which that map is based, it's based on really a series of extrapolations from a very uneven set of data of geographic units with known species numbers, from an interpolated map of vascular plant species richness, from predicted species numbers based on climatic parameters that eventually give you this kind of synthetic picture. So it's a modeled view rather than an empirically determined view of the distribution of plant diversity. And we'd obviously like to go quite a lot further than that, and I think we need to go a lot further than that if we're to really get an understanding of the distribution of plant diversity and how it can be conserved. And because we'd like to go on to model it, for example, and say, what does changing climate do to that distribution? And it would be better to start from an empirical base rather than itself a model-based view. The taxonomists, of course, can help in some respects, but they tend not to be organized around ecological units. So this, for example, is a distribution map for about 370 geographic units, these so-called taxonomic data working group level 3 countries, which some are countries, some are states, and so on. That's about 100,000 species standardized for those areas. So that's about as close as we can get from the kind of taxonomic angle at the moment. But one of the very interesting things that emerges, and I think that this is of clear conservation relevance for that, is that if you look at the distribution of species across those TADWOG units, then a very familiar pattern emerges, and that is that most species, a little over 65% of them, only occur in one of those regions. So most species are rare. There are very few widespread species. And in a sense, that plays back to a degree to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which gives the responsibility for the conservation of biological diversity to individual countries. A lot of those are endemics. And these are obviously the same plants, very often the ones that are extremely endangered. The big issue with plant diversity is our very uneven understanding of the planet. And I've used this comparison a number of times between the UK's flora and the Madagascan flora. The Madagascan flora may be about 12,000 species, the British flora about 1,500, 1,400 native species. And the differences are very, very clear. In the UK, we know the species of conservation concern. There are very few endemic species. Some of these species we know quite well in terms of their ecology, and many of them are protected in Exsitu. In Madagascar, we have very high levels of endemism. We haven't really identified the species of conservation concern. For many of these species, we know very, very little about them, and we find lots of new species all the time. Estimates for the total size of the flora of Madagascar are in this range of 8 to 12,000 species, and the approach that we've taken at Kew is rather than to take on the whole flora, we've picked out some of the biggest and most distinctive groups, the legumes, the palms, and so on. And when we do that, we can also start to analyze what we actually know about those groups. If you take all the specimens of Leguminosae, pretty much all the specimens of Leguminosae in the herbarium collections of the world, and they're really only in 3 major herbaria, Paris, London, Missouri Botanical Garden, and a much smaller herbarium in Madagascar, and then you put them into a GIS system, which we've done, and plot their distribution. This is what emerges. And you can see very clearly the very uneven knowledge and the rather predictably distributions following the main roads. So there's still a lot of basic exploration to be done in Madagascar. If you then go to those legume collections and ask, how many specimens do we have to represent all of these species? What you find is that about half of the species of Madagascar legumes, all we know about them is less than 10 herbarium specimens. So our knowledge of these species is very poor. So when someone says to me, well, we need a kind of complete representation for molecular phylogeny of this group, well, it's a little bit of a struggle when all we've got is less than 10 herbarium specimens of some of these things. Some of these things, of course, one might call sort of Lazarus taxa. They're collected and then not seen again for 70 or 80 years until eventually someone might or might not find them again. And as we did the orchid and palm accounts, this just gives the kind of numbers. Orchids, about 1,000 species, 1 in 10 of them new. Palms, 70 new species out of 170 total in the flora. Legumes, 129 out of 667. So I think that gives you a sense of just how much we still have to learn about the flora of the tropics. It's quite interesting. One of the things that we've been able to do with the Index Qensis database is keep track of new species and figure out just roughly how many new species of plants are being described every year. And the answer is about 2,000 that are believed by their authors to be generally new. So on average, over the last decade or so, it's about 2,000 new species every year. And we can also look and see where they're coming from. And where are they coming from? Well, they're coming from countries that have high plant diversity, but they're also coming from countries that have a lot of effort going into that plant diversity. So they're coming from places like China, Australia, Brazil, where you have a pretty good and growing group of scientists focused on that flora. Places like Ecuador, where overseas scientists have been extremely active. And you know that if the same amount of effort went into places like Peru and Borneo and Madagascar, that you'd be getting an equivalent number of species from those places. It's also quite interesting going back to those that taxonomic database working group graph to ask, how widely distributed are the species, the new species that we're finding? And again, predictably, if you analyze the data and put them into bins, it's very clear that the vast majority of species that we're finding now tend to be rather restricted in their distribution. So this statement that you often hear that species are disappearing before we've even discovered them is almost certainly true, because there are lots and lots and lots of rare species out there, lots and lots and lots of change going on all the time. And the new species that we're finding in general now are species that are very narrowly distributed. And there are some really great examples of that. And they're not unimportant. In the paper that Jim Doyle published on the Hydrotelaceae just a couple of weeks ago in Nature, about half of the 25 or so species have been of the species have been discovered in the last 25 years. This is an important genus in the Cyperaceae, seems to be sister group to a very large clade of within the Cyperaceae, and this species has only been discovered recently, occurs very narrowly distributed on cliffs in Thailand. And then the classic example is this one, the Wollemi pine, discovered in 1994, not so far, less than 150 kilometers from the center of Sydney, in an a new genus in a family of conifers that only has 2 genera. How many individuals are there in the wild? About 100. These are the kinds of new species that we're finding, and obviously they're of major conservation concern. The Australians, quite rightly, have severely restrict access to the Wollemi area because what they're concerned about is a disease, a fire that could quickly wipe out the whole population. And Wollemi is another one of these examples, like Metasequoia, of a plant that was known in the fossil record before it showed up alive and well and living in a somewhat precarious state not too far from Sydney. Well, what are the pressures on plant diversity? Well, I won't spend a lot of time on this because the pressures are the ones that you know all about, but I will go through them quickly. And I think it's also worth reflecting it's 100 years since Rachel Carson's birth this year. And I think looking back on that, obviously that book had a huge impact. But I think in hindsight, and particularly in the context of our current concern about climate change, perhaps the most profound thing was the extent to which the whole of the biosphere is interconnected, such that those synthetic pesticides have turned up just about everywhere. And indeed, we now know that they're found, for example, in places far, far away from where they were originally used. A report that I think's really quite important and has, I'd suggest, some degree of traction, although how important it turns out to be in the long term remains to be seen, is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This was released basically 2 years ago and represented the beginning of an intergovernmental panel on climate change type approach, but for the world's ecosystems, not specifically looking at the state of biological diversity, but more focused on the state of ecosystem services and the services that they provide for human well-being. It sought to look towards the future in terms of evaluating the importance of ecosystems for human well-being, and it also looked at the main drivers of change in biodiversity ecosystems, identifying habitat change, climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, and pollution, diffuse pollution of nitrogen and phosphorus particularly. I'll just give a few examples, plus another category which I think will become increasingly important, and that is a change in management regime. Because to the extent that the environments in which biodiversity survives are environments that are heavily influenced by us, then as those management practices are changed, then that will obviously, for one reason, either willingly or not, then that will obviously have an impact on the survival of species in those habitats. And I'll give you some examples of that, which you see obviously very clearly in a landscape like the UK that's been heavily influenced by humans for a very long period of time, but where I would suggest we're going to see much more frequently around the rest of the world too. So habitat loss and fragmentation. This is just a map of the impact of cultivated systems on the planet, taken from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It doesn't account for the other side, which is grazing, which would also take up a huge area, and it gives you some measure of the extent in terms of the sheer area of our impact on terrestrial ecosystems. Fragmentation disrupts natural processes, and fragmentation makes habitats and populations more susceptible to degradation or local extinction. And as an example, we still have some pretty good remnants of prairie around Chicago, but one of the processes that no longer works there, at least naturally, is burning. And so without artificial burning, those prairies very quickly take on a different character, and the species that they're meant to conserve obviously change. Overexploitation is an issue not just with plants, but with many other organisms too. CITES is meant to control that to some degree. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. We had some experience with that at Kew because we were the UK scientific authority for CITES on plants. So we had to pass judgment on the many thousands of applications that came through every year on CITES with respect to plants, which obviously covered timber and all sorts of other things. About 25,000 plant taxa are subject to CITES controls, which indicates, I think, for one thing, that you do need specialists who can actually identify those 25,000 plant taxa. The question, however, is the effectiveness of CITES and the extent to which it works. And because CITES is an international treaty, it moves very, very slowly. It goes through the same sequence of events that the Convention on Biological Diversity goes through. That is a meeting of the Conference of the Parties, so-called the signatories to the treaty, every 4 years, interspersed with a meeting of the scientific body that happens in the alternate 2 years. And there's a lot of debate, and you'll have seen it in the newspaper, about how specific groups of organisms are treated. But a lot of things which are not yet covered under CITES are also being overexploited in the wild. This is an example that I use. It's of an African tree, a tree in the genus Prunus, in the cherry genus, Prunus africana. It's not a particularly rare tree. It's quite a widespread tree in Africa. But it is increasingly collected for its bark. And if you chop down trees and take the bark off, then you've killed them. And the bark is used in the treatment of benign prostate hyperplasia. And it's collected from the wild. And Prunus africana is in reasonable shape for now. But unless there's some control exerted over the harvesting of Prunus africana, unless it's regulated in some way, it'll quickly find itself endangered. And the same could be said particularly in China. I'm sure here, as in the UK, there's an enormous resurgence of interest in traditional Chinese medicine. And that's of enormous conservation concern. not only for the users in the West, but also for the authorities in China, and trying to get a handle on that, both in terms of correct identification of the plants being used, but also their sustainable use in the wild is an important area that we were involved in Kew. Change in management is, I think, worth mentioning a little bit, and I've said a little bit about it already. We had another estate at Kew, actually a larger estate than Kew, a thing called Wakehurst Place, down in the Weald of Sussex. And the woodlands in that area have been managed for charcoal for a very, very long time. And continuing that management practice is very, very important. We continued to manage it for charcoal. We sold the charcoal. We're always looking to make a buck. But it was also extremely important, for example, for the hazel dormouse, which is one of Britain's rarer mammals that lives in the coppiced woodlands on the hazel. So continuing that management practice was not only important for the flora, and the flora included other rare plants like the British filmy fern, but also the animals. So one of the concerns for conservation in the UK is the nature of changing management practices. One of the great things about the UK is that we still do have a tremendous cadre of very, very strong amateur naturalists. The data that they provide us with could never really be accumulated by a professional. There's analogous to the bird data here in the US, which we also have in the UK. But change in the British flora is watched very closely by these amateurs, and they published just in 2005 this summary of the changes that could be observed in the British flora between 1987, doesn't seem so long ago, and 2004, and really quite significant changes can already be observed in the British flora. Some of them due to changes in management practices, some of them due to climate, and I'll just give you a few examples as we go through. Here's one, Viola luteir, and as you see these maps, the little red dots are areas from which they've disappeared. The blue dots are gains. So losses of Viola luteir, and that seems to be related to slight changes in grazing regimes. In general, the problem in Britain is that the uplands are overgrazed and the lowlands are undergrazed. And that has a very negative impact on the plants in those areas. Changes in nutrient status is something that perhaps doesn't get as much attention as it perhaps deserves. But certainly in the UK, and for example with this Campanular latifolia, this seems to be a species that is sensitive to eutrophication and the increasing spillover, if you like, of the impact of widespread use of nitrogenous fertilizers in agricultural systems. Invasive species problems in the British flora with regard to invasive species pale into insignificance compared to the ones in other parts of the world. Half of our flora are arguably invasive species, maybe only about 1,400 native species, and about the same number that have come in over the last 500 years or so. But they're still coming in. I mean, at Kew itself, one of the issues with traditional British bluebell woodlands was the mixing that was going on between escaped Spanish bluebells and the native British bluebells, and the extent to that was eroding genetic diversity in the British bluebell populations. But there are still invasive species that are spreading. One, a water plant, Lemna minuta, another, an onograceous weed, Epilobium brunescens. Bromus tectorum, those of you in this part of the world, but particularly further north in the Columbia Basin, know all about its effect. And around the world, the impact of invasive species does have a significant impact on the nature of the ecosystem services provided. In South Africa, the major problem is with invasions from Australia of species coming into southern Africa. And the South African government estimates that about 7% of its total potential freshwater runoff is co-opted by profligate water users that are invasive species from outside the country. which is why the South African government is putting a huge amount of effort into the Working for Water program to try and get some of those invasives out of the watersheds in which they occur. And climate change, I won't dwell on, but obviously that raises huge implications, especially in fragmented landscapes, for the future, not only the future of plants, but the ecosystems that they comprise. And I think, for example, the work being done in Southern Africa is just beginning to try and understand the dimensions of the impact on climate change on some of these unique Southern African biomes. And in the UK, the spread, for example, of this species, Lactuca cereola, is one that seems to be linked to increased warmth. And other things are happening all the time. Diseases. Those of you that have spent any time in the UK in the spring know what a distinctive feature of the landscape the horse chestnuts are, the conker trees. Just the map above is the spread of this particular pathogen, Campanaria, which is a leaf miner. That's where it was in 2001. The lower map is where it was in 2005. It's spreading very fast through the horse chestnut populations. And that seems to be linked also to climate change. So those are some of the drivers. Well, what are the kind of conservation responses by the international community? It's been interesting to kind of look at this. Biodiversity in Rio was kind of front and center. 10 years later in Johannesburg, it was not. And the picture in Johannesburg had very much switched, maybe quite properly, to the whole question of the UN Development Goals, Millennium Development Goals, and the whole question of poverty alleviation. But the main point is that biodiversity has slipped off center stage. And so really now, and this I think is where the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is coming from, the issue about biodiversity is making the connection to these other areas, to things that affect people's livelihoods: agriculture, water, health, energy. And there are many connections for plants in that area, but that's what needs to be articulated. And that's the kind of thing that gets government attention, as I'll say a little more about in a moment. There was this 2010 biodiversity target to achieve by 2010, this is good political speak, a significant reduction of the current rate of biodiversity loss at global, regional, national levels. Well, to get a reduction in the rate, that means you've got to measure the rate twice, and we don't even have a basis really for measuring it once, at least with relation to plants and maybe with many other groups too. Certainly, with respect to vertebrates, I think we can say with a fair degree of certainty that the number of species that are threatened with extinction is in the neighborhood of about 10 to 15%. With plants, you get similar kinds of numbers, but because of the scale of the problem, the degree of assessment that's been done is much, much less. We have a few groups, like we've assessed all of the conifer, or most of the conifer species, but we haven't done them all. So one of the ways that you might hope to measure loss of biodiversity is sort of progression through the red list categories, which has been done for various animal groups, but which is very much more difficult to do with plants. So there is some interest now by the IUCN to develop what they call a sampled red list index, which is trying to get some reasonable sample across many different groups and to monitor those through time to see how the trend is going. Population size is the other thing to do, and that's what's inherent in the WWF's Living Planet Index. But again, for plants, while we sometimes have population data, more often we don't. And again, most of that data is based on vertebrates. So at the end of the day, what could Q do? And I'll finish up with some remarks on some additional dimensions. Well, we were able to do, I think, what we were able to do at the Field Museum. Capacity building in terms of training and organizations and facilities. Tools for conservation in terms of making material available on the web, red listing, identification guides, so on. priorities for in situ conservation. For example, we work very hard in Madagascar, where there's a particular opportunity. And the president of Madagascar has made a commitment to dramatically expand the protected area system in Madagascar. And the question is, how do you decide where specifically to do that? And new vegetation maps and new assessments of floristic diversity are very, very important in a joint project between Kew and Conservation International to working with the Malagasy authorities to try and establish where those new reserves should go and how they should best complement the system of existing reserves. But I think botanic gardens have another possibility, which is this question of ex situ collections, not only making them and keeping them, but also using them in reintroduction and restoration efforts. Wallemia is a good example, and I think the Australians handled it really brilliantly, because the first thing they did was that they started to commercialize it. They said this would be a great plant to get into horticulture. They held an auction at Sotheby's last year, which raised a lot of money based on vegetative propagation from the original trees. We helped in that. David Attenborough and Kenneth Branner came and helped us plant Wallemia seedlings at Kew, and you can now buy Wallemia on the open market, and I think that's a prudent thing. If you've only got 100 or so individuals in the wild, it makes sense to get them out and get them into cultivation. It's an essential insurance policy, and botanic gardens have done that for a long time. This is the Café Marron, a species endemic to Rodrigues in the Indian Ocean that now exists only in botanic gardens, and there are many, many examples of plants that no longer exist in the wild. But the real way to do that is obviously through ex situ collections of seed. And we had an interesting experience. There are two great national institutions in Kew, the National Archives Office and the Royal Botanic Gardens. Well, the National Archives Office came across this packet that was taken from a Dutch ship in 1804. And had been kept in the National Archives all those years. It had some seeds in it. Those seeds still germinated. So seeds will last a long time. And obviously in proper seed banks, they do a bit better than in a leather packet in the National Archives. Earlier this week, I was in Rome, and there's a lot of interest in rationalizing the current system of ex situ collections for crop plants. There are something like 1,400 seed banks around the world, but many of them aren't in very good shape. Many of the collections inside them are duplicated, and there's a lot of interest, particularly through the Global Crop Diversity Trust, which had its first meeting on Tuesday and yesterday of this week, to rationalize that system and back up those genetic resources. And this is also a good example, by the way, of an unintended consequence of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Because as soon as the Convention on Biological Diversity came in and gave individual countries, in a sense, rights over their national patrimony, very appropriate, it also immediately clamped down on the international exchange of genetic resources for food and agriculture. That's now been solved by a new agreement, which took a long time to negotiate, but now there is sharing again. And the idea of the Global Crop Diversity Trust is to secure those collections of genetic diversity for the future. So far, it's raised about $133 million, including $30 million from the Gates Foundation. That $30 million from the Gates Foundation is to rescue and get into good backup situations, the materials that are scattered, the important materials that are scattered in those gene banks around the world. And the remainder is to update the core set of gene banks around the world so that the 50 or so crops that we depend on for about 80% of the world's food consumption from plants are secured for the future. These are some of the species that fall under the international undertaking. And this is connected to the development of this new seed bank in Svalbard that you may well have read something about. At Kew, particularly in the light of the fact that most species are rare. Many of these species are rare in the wild, consist of population with few individuals. We think that the seed banking approach bears application to a much wider variety of plant diversity. So we opened in 2000 the seed bank building, focused particularly on the plants of Africa. And we negotiated formal access and benefit sharing agreements with this list of countries, the bulk of whom are in sub-Saharan Africa. Negotiating those agreements, by the way, wasn't particularly straightforward. The first one that we got was the US, interestingly enough, to sign up. The second we got to sign up was Burkina Faso. So in a way, we had both ends of the economic spectrum pegged. And then we went on to Madagascar and Kenya and South Africa and so on. That program is now going ahead at the Millennium Seed Bank at Wakehurst Place, adding around about 3,000 new species every year. And for many of those species, they've never been germinated before. You know, we have to figure out how to grow them and then figure out how to look after them. And all of that work is done in partnership with the relevant agencies in those countries. This is Burkina Faso collecting some of the amazing variety of seed that now finds its way back into the seed bank. Along the way, some other very important things happen. Training, preliminary red list assessments, herbarium specimens, field information on population status and threats. All of those things are very, very positive for the future, and relatively speaking, it's cheap. We know that under good conditions, most things that will, not everything survives in seed banks, obviously, but most things that do survive in seed banks will last for hundreds of years if the conditions are right. The question then becomes, how do you use those seed bank collections? Well, I think we've already started to use them in the UK. These are seedlings of the latest slipper orchid, Cypripedium calceolus, which we've introduced along with several other species of orchids now back into the wild in the UK. But that data is also important for other species. Prunus africana, for example, happens to be one of the species that doesn't survive well in seed banks. But the whole business of collecting Prunus africana and figuring out how to germinate it is a basis for starting nurseries of Prunus africana so that the thing can be grown in plantations rather than just collected from the wild. And I'd like to finish with, you know, the opportunities for restoration. And one of the best examples that I know is the Chicago example, where the old Joliet Arsenal, more than 19,000 acres, not far from Chicago, has been turned over to USDA. And there, gardening is going on a very, very large scale. Taking out the drainage tiles, getting rid of the non-native trees and shrubs, introducing burning to encourage the growth of native prayer. And it's in these kinds of situations that the knowledge we gain from developing seed banks and the materials that we gain from those seed banks has a chance to be plowed back into what will obviously become an increasingly important issue, which is how to restore some of the degraded ecosystems that we've created over the past several hundred years. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah.
I think one of the most surprising slides for me was the one showing the number of new species being described per year. Absolutely no evidence of any diminishment in that number. Certainly suggesting we're nowhere near saturation.
Absolutely.
Which makes estimating total numbers of species extremely difficult.
Yeah, there's no indication that we're leveling out. And but I think, in a way, so how long will we go on doing this? That's an open question. But I think what is interesting to me is that the ones that we're finding, as you'd kind of predict, are the ones which have very narrow distributions, where we, maybe they were never very common to start with. And they are inevitably the ones which are most susceptible to being lost, just through bad luck, if nothing else. And that I think raises the issue of how are you going to deal with that on a kind of from a conservation point of view. Yeah.
How much of that is a long Hiller's question, as far as numbers of species, and I guess maybe associated with that is a question, but maybe that's not really the way to look at biological diversity anyhow. I mean, we have lots of diversity within species.
There was another bar there which showed new combinations. So the 2,000 species is after you've taken out the new combinations. So to that extent, they appear to be new. As to the nature of the species category and whether that's an appropriate unit to use, obviously that's a bigger question. But also a question on which I think we do have some data. If you look, for example, at Linnaeus's species and ask how have they fared over the last 250 years, most of those species have fared pretty well. And they tended to be species that were relatively common, so in many cases they've been investigated in more detail. So perhaps 80% of Linnaeus's species hold up as kind of distinct units in nature, even based on modern knowledge. Lots of groups, of course, where the genetic situation, apomix or whatever, makes it a much more complicated story. But I think there is some evidence for the reality of species in nature, and I think examples like Wallemia, which is clearly a very distinct thing and very different from anything else, is not just a splitters lumpus issue.
Yeah, here. So this is a question that comes from me as an animal biologist, and I'd like to hear Jeff say that. So one of the things that everybody seemingly in the world does, certainly in the developed world, is people have gardens. And, what are gardens? Gardens are taking largely non-native species where we are encouraged to put them out in the wild and, put them out there where native pollinators and stuff can get to them, and take great pride in having them thrive. And we could never do that in the animal world. They just wouldn't, there's all kinds of laws against that. And in terms of
space, there'll be laws against it for plants very soon. Yeah.
As an issue with invasive species, hybridization of native species, is it?
No, it's definitely an issue, and it's. I think it's true. My sense is that most of the, well, first of all, obviously, the number of invasive species compared to the total number of species that have moved around is obviously very small. But nevertheless, they have big impacts. They can have huge impacts. The question is, have they been introduced by, let's call them gardeners rather than kind of land managers? And in general, they tend to be introduced, as far as I can see, by land managers who think they're doing a good thing. So the very famous ones, kudzu, for example, these tend to be things that people have introduced because they thought they were a really good idea, and the same applies elsewhere. So I think it's a question of kind of, the problem is it's hard to predict in advance which species, and obviously the same species can have different impacts in different kinds of environments. So I think it probably is something where, sooner or later somebody will take a kind of regulatory review of this. It's very hard to put them back in the box once they've gotten out. But I hope when they do that, they balance that, because it'll have unintended consequences. I hope when they do that, they will balance that with the idea that getting a lot of these plants into cultivation is literally their only hope for survival. Interestingly enough, the Convention on Biological Diversity, again, and one of its unintended consequences, has kind of worked against that. There used to be an old adage in the garden world that said, if you've got a rare plant, the best thing you can do is give it away. Because yours was bound to die sooner or later, and the best thing you can do is to get it out into other people's collections so that the thing stays in cultivation. If you start taking the spirit of the CBD, pre-1992 to all of the things that are in cultivation, you'd be very worried about giving things away. Because what Chile would say is you try and give away Tequilophilia cyanocrocus, which exists in a very tiny population now in Chile. It's widely grown, would say it's not yours to give away anymore. It's ours to give away. And obviously, that starts to work against conservation, I think. So as usual with all of these things, it's very hard to come up with a series of hard and fast rules. And as soon as they start to regulate, the one thing I have learned is that regulation is a very blunt instrument. And it has, almost inevitably has unintended consequences. I mean, CBD and its consequences for plant breeding was very negative. And it took them 7 years to straighten that out through international negotiations.
It strikes me that both Kew and Missouri Botanical Garden have programs in Madagascar. Even given that it's a mega diverse country, is there some type of consultation to decide where you're going to work, how you're working together, and so on? Is that the kind of additional collaboration?
I think it's very much collaboration. We've published a lot jointly, and we've tended to take rather different sort of approaches. We've both maintained offices in Madagascar. We've both been involved in the training and capacity building of plant diversity resources in Madagascar. And we very much do combine our data. In general, Missouri has taken a view of kind of trying to look across the whole flora. Our view has been to take some of the more difficult groups, the big groups, palms, legumes, orchids, and really focus on those because we had the specialists to deal with them. I think both approaches are useful. And in a country like Madagascar, where you've got an 80% level of endemism, whatever you can do is important. We've also, Madagascar is one of the countries that we're working with very actively on the seed banking. And I think that's an important part of the overall conservation strategy for Madagascar too. So whether one, I mean, this is a much different question, sort of an administrative question, whether you can come up with a strategy by which everybody's efforts would be beautifully coordinated. Good luck on that. Everybody's got different governance organizations. Everyone's under different kinds of pressure. Getting them to kind of agree, particularly on it, everything changes all the time. But I think, the important thing is that there are three main herbaria working with the Malagasy authorities. Paris, because of their colonial connections. Kew, which has been there for a long time in Missouri. And I think, in general, the level of collaboration between those organizations, in that case, in Madagascar, is pretty good.
One last thing. I'm imagining that the focus of the seed collection on dryland species has to do with the greater longevity of dryland seeds.
Yep.
Do you know of anyone who's working on methods for preserving wet habitat seeds, tropical rain, wet tropical forest seeds, etc.? Is anyone trying to figure out ways of preserving those long term?
Well, obviously, there are established ways for those crop plants that fall into this recalcitrant category. But they tend to be rather expensive compared to seed banking. The joy of seed banking is that the same kinds of conditions work for just about everything. Kew does have a research program going on that to try and understand, what is it exactly that makes seed recalcitrant or not. And you often get the same thing side by side in the same genus. There are different species of Acer, for example. Some are orthodox, some are recalcitrant. And I think there's research going on elsewhere. But the one thing I would say is that I think the scale of collecting operation that we've been involved in, which hasn't only been in the dry lands, has convinced us that the ratio is maybe a little different than we thought. And that the number of orthodox, the proportion of orthodox is perhaps higher than we originally thought. There's always going to be a percentage of recalcitrant seeds that are going to have to be dealt with in some way. Either we're going to have to figure out how to deal with them in seed banks, or they're going to have to be propagated in some other way, clonally. But it is surprising, even in the wet tropics, that there are things that will do well in seed banks. It depends on what their particular ecology is and the kinds of habitats that they live in.